Okay, so I think we'll begin. I think David Hirsh is on his way virtually. So good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So today we have also a packed schedule, so we'll try and start on time. So our first speaker will be Dave Rich. Dave is the head of policy at the Community Security Trust, which is probably the preeminent Jewish security defense organization in the world. David is an expert on issues of left-wing anti-Semitism. He's associate research fellow at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck College at the University of London, where he completed his PhD. Dave Rich just published a book recently entitled The Left's Jewish Problem, Jeremy Corbyn, Israel and Anti-Semitism, which was based largely on his doctoral thesis. So Dave is going to speak today. The title of his talk is called Anti-Semitism and the Gaza Conflict in May 2021, What is New and What is Old? So Dave will have to leave in about an hour or so. So he's going to speak first, and then we'll have Q&A specifically for Dave Rich. And then the second speaker will be David Hirsh, and I'll introduce David.
Good afternoon.
I'll introduce David after Dave Rich is done. So Dave, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Great, thank you, Charles. Thank you for inviting me. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's nice to see some old friends and to meet virtually, at least, hopefully some new friends. One day we'll be all in the same room together. As Charles said, I'm going to be speaking about the wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish incitement and extremism that we saw in the UK during the recent conflict in Israel and Gaza. And I'm specifically going to talk about what happened that really just repeated what we've seen in previous episodes, where we've had conflicts in Israel triggering spikes in anti-Semitism in the diaspora, but also what was new this time around, because there were a few different things that happened in the UK that were definitely new in terms of the language, the people, the modes of expression of the anti-Semitism and so on. I'm going to run through some of those, and then hopefully we can have a good conversation about it. So I'm going to be showing you some pictures. If I can find my presentation. Here we go. Let's start here. Let's start the slideshow. Let's see if we can get it going. Sorry, I don't know why it's not coming up on the screen properly. That's a bit annoying.
Ira, do you have any suggestions? Daphne?
If you, in your bottom right there, there's the presentation
that one.
mode button. Yep.
Ah, it's gone on the wrong screen. That's why. It's a bit annoying. Can you see? You can't see it, can you?
We can see the PowerPoint, we just don't see it in full screen.
Yeah. I'll tell you the problem. I've got two screens here and it's coming up on the wrong one. There we go. Right, yeah. So there you go. That's full screen now, right? Okay.
Yes.
So this, the chart you can see on the right-hand side of this screen is a count of the daily number of anti-Semitic incidents reported to CST during the recent conflict. You know, one of the things we do at CST, we take reports of anti-Semitic hate crimes or hate incidents from victims, witnesses, family members, from the police as well, from right across the whole of the United Kingdom. This is what we do, you know, is our bread and butter work at CST. And the left-hand side of that chart, you can see the daily incident totals are pretty constant. That's for the month from the 7th of April to the 7th of May. They're pretty constant and they're fairly low. It's single figures each day. And then from kind of the 8th of May onwards for most of May and into the first week or so of June, those daily incident totals were much, much higher. So, 4 or 5 times as high as we would normally get. And the month of May ended up being the highest monthly total for anti-Semitic incidents we've ever recorded at CST, higher than during the conflicts in Israel and Gaza in 2014, higher than in 2009, higher than during the Lebanon War in 2006. It was the most intense we've seen it. The picture on the left is a research report we published a couple of weeks ago, which is available on the CST website, which has all of this data and lots of examples I'm going to run through now. So what am I talking about when I talk about anti-Semitic incidents during the conflict? Here's just a handful of examples. The most serious incident was the one that the headline on the top left, a rabbi in London who was beaten up really badly by 2 guys who just saw him in his car and saw that he was Jewish. Those 2 people have been arrested and charged. They're going to stand trial for what was a very serious physical assault. Loads of stuff on social media. You see on the bottom left, a threat to attack, Zionists, as it puts it, in Manchester, but it then goes on to describe Zionists. It talks about payot, about side curls being cut off. So it's clearly using Zionist as a synonym for Jew. And that is something that we definitely saw a lot of during the conflict. And the one on the right, the main picture is graffiti on the door of a Messianic synagogue in Norwich. Norwich is a town in England with a very small Jewish community. Those of you who know your history of anti-Semitism will know Norwich is where the very first blood libel was in 1144. This graffiti is interesting in itself because you have the anti-Semitic slur at the top, the word kike. You have a swastika at the bottom, a very obvious anti-Jewish symbol, but in the middle you have the slogan "Free Palestine." And "Free Palestine" was the slogan that was emblematic of all the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel campaigning that went on in the UK during this conflict. "Free Palestine" and "From the River to the Sea" were the emblematic slogans, but "Free Palestine" was also the slogan that was most commonly used in anti-Semitic hate crime. It was shouted at visibly Jewish people on the street who were singled out because they're Jewish, shouted in order to abuse and harass them. It was daubed on synagogues, as you see here. This was not the only example of "Free Palestine" being daubed on or at synagogues during that month. So it became this phrase of kind of dual meaning, of kind of a standard political campaigning slogan, but one that then in certain contexts was kind of weaponized in order to harass Jews. This is an image from a video that came to sum up all the anti-Semitism during the conflict. It was a convoy of cars that drove from various towns in the north of England down to London, which is about a 200-mile drive, on one weekend afternoon, a Sunday afternoon. There was a demonstration in London that day, and they were driving down for it. And they drove all the way down the motorway with Palestinian flags on the bonnets of the cars, as you can see, waving Palestinian flags out of the window. And as they passed through North London, they passed through heavily Jewish areas of North London where the Jewish community lives. And there were several incidents of people in these cars shouting abuse, chasing cars driven by Jewish people. And this was the incident that really went viral online and went around the world to a large degree, because in one of those 2 black cars sat at the traffic lights at the front of that queue was someone with a megaphone, and out of the car window, he was shouting with his megaphone, "This is London, F the Jews, rape their daughters, rape their mothers," and a whole stream of really vile anti-Semitic and misogynistic abuse. It was videoed by a Jewish woman who lived in a flat that overlooked the road. She put it on social media and it went completely viral. And it just came to sum up what was happening. And when we talk about what was old and what was new, one of the things that was really new this time was the use of or the practice of driving cars with Palestinian flags through Jewish neighborhoods. So this incident got all the attention, but it was happening almost every day. up and down the country in Jewish neighborhoods, in not just in London and in Manchester, but everywhere from Bournemouth to Glasgow and all points in between. Most days or nights at CST, we would get a complaint from somewhere around the country of cars, either singly or in convoys, driving through Jewish neighborhoods, waving the flags, honking the horn, shouting Free Palestine at the Jewish people on the streets. And it just became a thing. It became a trend. And I think one reason it became a trend, you know, there were lots of aspects of what happened during the conflict that I think were indirectly influenced by the pandemic and by COVID. And one of these is that driving in cars is a COVID-safe way to do a political protest, right? And this wasn't the only time that we saw that. Now, there were loads of demonstrations on the streets with tens of thousands of people in very COVID unsafe situations. But the use of cars developed partly, I think, as a way of doing a demonstration, doing a rally in a bit of a more COVID safe way. And then it just snowballed. Now, of course, there were loads of demonstrations on the streets, like I said, and I'm going to show you some of the placards and some of the things that we saw on these, because they also were indicative of some of the anti-Semitic discourse and imagery that we saw. Now, here's to making the comparison of Israel to Nazi Germany, and actually with the use of swastikas on placards. And just to be clear, these are homemade placards. Now, there were loads of these, right? Most people who went on the anti-Israel demonstrations did not take anti-Semitic placards or do any anti-Semitic chanting, but a minority of people did, and they didn't seem to suffer any consequences from the people around them for doing it. So it's almost, I think, it's almost at the stage now where the one place in public where you can walk up and down the street waving a placard with a swastika on it and no harm will come to you is on a demonstration against the world's only Jewish state, right? If you just did it, if you just walked out on a normal high street waving a placard, people will call the police. But if you're demonstrating against Israel, they won't. And there were loads of these, not all with swastikas, but loads and loads of people who'd sat at home with a piece of cardboard and a marker pen or a paintbrush and thought to themselves, what's the most important message I can put on my placard to take this protest today? And their conclusion was, I've got to say that Israel is either just as bad as Nazi Germany or even worse. All right? There were loads, some of them involving young people. And this in a way was another sort of kind of quite shocking thing and quite new thing, was the age of some of the protesters. And, you know, this is just a picture of a couple of young people with Holocaust, making horrible Holocaust comparisons, one of them. But this went around on social media as well. This is an Instagram post from an account called Free Palestine 1948, which again is interesting. It's the phrase Free Palestine, but 1948 shows they very much mean the whole of Israel and the territories. And this post, as you can see, an Israeli soldier looking in the mirror, seeing a Nazi soldier doing the same thing, with the slogan being the irony of becoming what you once hated, had almost 40,000 likes. Now, I know that this went round on the social media of loads and loads of teenagers and secondary school, high school kids in this country. And I know it because my kids were telling me that's what they were seeing on their friends' social media feeds. I suppose you could almost see it as an unintended consequence and ironic success of Holocaust education in this country, that young people are so conscious of the Holocaust. But it's just ubiquitous in the kind of discourse of anti-Israel campaigning, both online and on the streets, is this comparison. So back to the demonstrations, as well as the comparison of Zionist Israel with Nazi Germany. If you look at the placard behind it and next to the right of it, you get kind of more traditional, older forms of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. This one about all the main media outlets, news outlets in this country being Israeli propaganda. These two placards, you know, on the left, you've got Benjamin Netanyahu literally as a devil with horns. I mean, it's that old anti-Semitic caricature of Jews with horns. On the right, you've got, again, Netanyahu as a snake, you know, and the snake was very common, or Jews being portrayed as snakes was very common in Nazi propaganda and also in kind of 19th century anti-Semitic propaganda. And we can even go all the way back right to the beginning of anti-Semitism And this again was on a really big protest in central London, with a picture of Jesus carrying the cross, and Jesus, the word next to him says Palestinians, do not let them do the same thing today again. Well, who is them? Them are the Jews that killed Jesus and are now killing the Palestinians, and they're doing it because that's how Jews behave. That's the meaning of this placard. And again, no one else around him, the person holding this, complained at all. So you've got this mixture of old and new anti-Semitic tropes and ideas. Now, another thing we saw, and this is something that was a bit different this time, was the kind of revival of secular Arab nationalism, but through but mixed with Islamic religious discourse. So I said the slogan "From the river to the sea" is something that we heard everywhere on all the protests. It wasn't just in the UK, this chant was everywhere. If you look at the placard on the left, so the placard says "From the river to the sea." You know, it's a slogan used by Hamas, it's been quoted by Hezbollah, but it's much more widespread than that. And then under it, single democratic state of Palestine, which was, well, secular democratic state of Palestine was always the policy of Fatah and the PLO originally. And then if you look at the bottom of that placard, it's from an organization called the IHRC, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, which is a pro-Iranian organization in this country. So you've got this whole mixture of different political, ideological viewpoints and perspectives coming together. And on the right, you've got an English translation of a very common Arabic chant, "With our soul, with our blood, we'll liberate Palestine." And again, it's a chant that has had both secular and religious expressions over the years. But this is a really interesting one here. This is a picture of two guys on a demonstration in central London in May, wearing T-shirts of Saddam Hussein. Right? I mean, literally they're Baathists. You know, you don't see much support for Saddam Hussein. You don't hear much of it. And here they are with their T-shirts of Saddam Hussein. You know, and the Ba'ath were you know, the archetype of secular Arab nationalism. And what were they doing on the demonstration? You'll see in the tweet on the right, they were chanting "Kaiba Kaiba Ya Yahud Jaish Muhammad Sauf Yahud," which I'm sure many of you will recognize, is a chant, an Arabic chant warning, harking back to the Battle of Khyber in the 7th century and warning the army of Muhammad will return to kill the Jews. It's a religious Islamic chant, but while they're wearing Saddam Hussein T-shirts, again, you get this kind of mixture again. And this was reflected in the profiles of anti-Semitic incident perpetrators. What these numbers and these circles on your screen show you, when people report anti-Semitic incidents to CST, we always ask them, can you describe to us the person who shouted at you or threw something at you, or if it's on social media, we'll look at the profiles. And we use, the British police have a standard kind of chart of different ways of describing people's ethnic appearance, which are the kind of 6 different descriptors you see on your screen. Now, in normal times, so in 2020, say, in the UK, most anti-Semitic hate incident offenders are described to us as being white. In previous rounds of conflict involving Israel and the Middle East, that has changed so that the biggest single group has tended to be described to us as South Asian. And South Asian has kind of a large overlap with where most of Britain's Muslim community comes from. This time around, the single biggest group, as you'll see, is the big circle on the left. People described to us as being Arab and North African. And some of the most extreme examples of incitement and anti-Jewish chanting and behavior on the demonstrations came from kind of young men of Arab appearance. And this was new, this was different. And it just suggests a bit of a shift of where the real sharp edge of this kind of extremism and anti-Semitism came from within this particular, the bounds of this particular reaction to what was going on in the Middle East. Now, that's what's going on in the demonstrations. Something else that happened that was really quite different was deliberate incitement, stunts to try and incite tension between communities, but mixed with online and offline behaviors, right? And the whole concept of influencers. You know, so much of the anti-Semitism that went around on social media was promoted online or was connected to this whole rise of influencer culture. But I want to start, when I talk about this, by talking not about people like, I don't know, celebrities and models and so on. But I want to explain what happened in London with a group of Muslim YouTubers, 3 Muslim YouTubers who between them have following on YouTube of about 1.4 million people. They're really quite well known in those kind of circles, in Islamist activist circles in Britain. And one day, one Saturday afternoon, so on the Shabbat, they turned up in Golders Green, which is probably the best known Jewish neighborhood in Britain, with this van that you can see. And on the side of the van were these massive screens flashing up pictures from Israel, pictures from Gaza, also, as you can see, bottom right, picture of Holocaust survivors. And they stopped Jewish people on the street, Orthodox Jews walking to and from synagogue or just on a Shabbat afternoon. And they put the camera in their faces and they challenged them on, what do you think of this? What do you think of what's going on in Gaza? Why does Israel kill children, et cetera, et cetera? Film their reactions, which, as you can imagine, some of those reactions were quite hostile, quite annoyed by what was going on. Chopped up that film, put it on YouTube, and went on YouTube under the title Muslims Confront Radical Israelis. Right now, none of the Jews they stopped on the street were Israeli; they were all British. And we saw this as a very deliberate attempt to incite incite tensions and conflict and friction between British Jews and British Muslims, using both the offline stunt and the online space as kind of a holistic package. As you'll see from the picture on the top left, the police were called. They didn't think that there was any kind of criminal offence, which I have to say we disagreed with, but that was their judgment call on the day. And this is just so you can see this. They then took the van to the BBC the next day just to try and get a bit more media coverage. And you can imagine taking this image into the heart of a Jewish neighborhood on the Shabbat. It's as inflammatory and as offensive as you can imagine. Now, this chap here, so this is a picture, you know, as I said, they stopped Jewish people on the street. They videoed them. They chopped up the video. This here, you can see the name of the video, Muslims Confront Radical Israelis, police called. Under the title of the video, you can see within about a week or so of them doing it, it had over 250,000 views on YouTube. And on the right are some of the comments that people have placed underneath saying, you know, we should all go to Golders Green, we should all go to these other Jewish neighborhoods. So clearly it's definitely stirring up animosity and tension, hostility towards Jewish people from amongst the people watching this video. Now, this chap on the right, the big guy, is a guy called Mohammed Hijab. And the very next day after they'd gone to Golders Green and done these videos, there was a pro-Israel rally outside the Israeli embassy in London. Mohammed Hijab turned up at that rally with a whole bunch of his followers. This other guy, here he is with the megaphone. The guy on the left is this chap here, same guy. So the two of them turned up. And he gave an incredibly aggressive speech in which he said, the difference between us and them is that for them, they think life begins. For us, we believe that death begins. We believe that life begins at death. We don't care about death. We love death. Now, those of you who are familiar with the language of Hamas and Al-Qaeda and other kind of jihadist and violent Islamist organizations will be very familiar with this kind of slogan of, you know, we love death, they love life, we love death, and so on. And he then goes on, if you think our people in Palestine or across the Arab and Muslim world would let go of the struggle in our sacred places like Al-Aqsa, you are grossly mistaken. And I think it would be a mistake to underestimate the impact of the religious emotions, the religiously based emotions that were stirred up by the fact that this round of fighting, this round of conflict began in and around Al-Aqsa and the Temple Mount and in Jerusalem. And so it began with that religious trigger. And I think that was one reason why the anti-Semitism and the extremism was so intense this time around. But this is something that was this role of YouTubers was very new. You know, previously we would have seen organizations, whether linked to the Muslim Brotherhood or linked to Al Muhajirun and others, it would be organizations who would be holding these demonstrations, who would be leading this kind of political charge online and on the streets. This time around, it wasn't really formal organizations as such that were at the cutting edge. It was these kind of more amorphous networks, these kind of online networks led by social media influencers effectively, but within these kind of extremist circles. Now I'll talk about influencer culture. Of course, there were other influencers better known across the world. You know, people like Mark Ruffalo tweeting about it being genocide, Bella Hadid tweeting all sorts of stuff or putting all sorts of stuff on Instagram, really following and promoting the idea that this is not a conflict. Right? This is not a two-sided conflict. This is either a genocide or it's colonialism. It's another manifestation of global racism and so on. And this had a massive, massive influence, not just from people like this, but also footballers. I mean, in Britain, you know, you had really well-known footballers in really high-profile matches carrying the Palestinian flag around at the end of the game. The one at the top left is after the FA Cup final. It's a match broadcast around the world. You know, on the right is Mesut Ozil, who's a German footballer who played for Arsenal for many years. There were loads and loads of examples of celebrities, sports stars, athletes, rappers, models, or actors, all the rest, putting loads and loads of this kind of content onto social media. And it had a massive impact in how young people understood and perceived and reacted to the conflict this time around. And what we saw in Britain is that it became a kind of wave of social media activism from young people that mapped onto exact previous waves around Black Lives Matter, around Me Too, around some other kind of climate change and some movements like this radical British climate change movement called Extinction Rebellion, various other ones like this. And it was the same kind of pattern of behavior. And that had a massive impact in British schools. This is a video. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it to play, but I will try.
Dave, there's no volume.
Okay, there's no volume. Can I don't know how I can find the volume.
You need to reshare, and on the bottom left, there should be a button that you click to share the sound.
Okay, look, it's a very short video. I don't need to go through it. Essentially, they're all chanting "Free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine," right? And there's, you know, quite a large number of kids. This is a school in Leicester. And there's quite a large number of kids, all, I don't know if it's lunchtime or whatever, all going into a school hall chanting "Free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine." This kind of stuff happened in a lot of schools around the country. And at CST, we had an unprecedented number of complaints from not just Jewish kids, but Jewish teachers in schools who were getting targeted for anti-Semitic abuse, which essentially entailed other pupils shouting "Free Palestine" at them whenever they walk down the corridor, just because they're Jewish. And for some of the teachers, it got to the stage where they literally couldn't teach. They couldn't even go into school because it's all they got. And this is not something we've ever encountered before, right? But it was a reflection of how there was this absolute avalanche of activism across teenage, high school, and student age groups in a way that we just haven't seen before. And that really, when we look at kind of what is new about what happened, that is in a way the newest thing, I think. The biggest change really is this this kind of nexus of the narrative that this is not a conflict, that this is colonialism and this is racism. spread through social media networks and supercharged by social media influencer culture, and landing on a mass scale in onto Jewish high school and students and university students in a way that they and we had never experienced before. And this is, I think, the challenge moving forward, is how do we actually deal with that? How do we address that? And how do we do it in a way, because there is now a debate in Britain about, is this political protest? Is it legitimate political protest? There are complaints from within the Muslim community that their young people are being prevented from discussing Palestine in school because teachers are telling them it's anti-Semitic. And that, on the other hand, we're getting complaints from Jewish kids saying, well, none of my friends at school will speak to me anymore because I haven't put Free Palestine on my Instagram bio, and I now want to move to a Jewish school. So how do we unpack that, and how do we move forward from that? That, in a way, is the biggest challenge for us, I think, moving forward. I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, Dave, thank you very much for an important presentation. So we're going to do a Q&A with Dave for about 15 minutes. And I see Dave Hirsh is with us. He's waiting online. So David Hirsh will speak after this brief Q&A. And David will speak, and we'll have a Q&A with David Hirsh as well. So Dave Rich, so given the highest recorded levels of anti-Semitic incidences that the CST has recorded ever, and I went to see some of the protests in May and June, and was struck by the energy, kind of a undercurrents of a sort of violence in the air. Given the CST's work of literally defending the Jewish community, individuals, institutions, schools, synagogues, do you feel that there is an imminent threat against the Jewish community now in a way that you haven't seen before, or is it sort of getting back to normal? What's your assessment of the threat of physical attacks today?
I think it's really interesting that you talk about the energy in this movement and in these protests. There was a huge amount of energy, and I think some of that was the release of a lot of pent-up feelings because of the pandemic. I think, but there was almost a joyousness about the protests. It was really liberating for people to go out in these massive crowds and chant until their voice was hoarse and all the rest of it. So that really escalated the energy. But also, I think it was energized by the fact that the core message was eliminationist. The core message was, why should we even just put up with Israel anymore? Not change policy, or don't take the houses in Sheikh Jarrah or anything like this. It was the thing that energized, the idea that energized all these movements was, in my view, eliminationist. Now, in terms of what threat this leaves, what legacy of threat this leaves for the Jewish community, look, most of the anti-Semitic hate crimes we saw were not violent, but then most anti-Semitic hate crimes at any time are not violent. But is there a legacy of threat? Of course there is. But that's not something we haven't seen before. This is the same. It's not a coincidence that 6 months after the last Gaza conflict in the summer of 2014, you had terrorist attacks against the Jewish community in France, right? And you had similar efforts in other countries. You get this kind of, and that's happened over the years. We definitely saw in this country the kind of pro-jihadist networks online, who normally the Jewish community is a lower priority for. While all this was going on, their chatter, their discourse became much more focused on the community. It's predictable that will happen. So I think it does leave a legacy of threat to Jewish communities, but it's only a matter of degree, because that threat was always there to some degree or other.
Okay, thank you. So I see, if anybody has any questions, please raise your electronic hand. I see a few people have questions. So Catherine, the floor is yours, and I see the others as well.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you for an absolutely brilliant presentation there. I have a very simple question for you that's going to be very difficult for you to answer. What can we do about this? How do we counter this? You know, we're really at a sea change, another period of sea change in the UK in terms of attitudes to Israel and attitudes to Jews. What do we now need to do to turn this around again?
In a way, there are changes. There are definitely changes. But I don't think what we've seen is a fundamental change in direction. I think what we've seen is a continuation of an escalation in certain parts of society that has been going on for a very long time, particularly on the left. You know, we've just come out of several years of really bruising years with the far left in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. And part of what we saw is a legacy of that as well. Now, the bigger picture is most people in Britain are not remotely anti-Semitic at all. Most people in Britain don't go along with any of this. Most people in Britain see people giving speeches about loving death in the middle of London and are completely revulsed by it. And so the bigger picture of what is the status of Jews in Britain, in this country, I think hasn't fundamentally changed. But what has fundamentally changed is that within those sectors where the problems come from, those problems are deeper. They are reaching the younger generation in a much more widespread way. People who've never thought about Israel-Palestine before and don't know anything about it, but got swept along because this is what all their friends had put on their Instagram, so they put it on their Instagram, right? So that, I think, that is where, so I think in terms of what we can do about it, there's all the usual stuff of make sure people are arrested and prosecuted for the hate crimes, find our allies in other communities, and so on and so on. But I think I think the new challenge that this has really thrown up is the people spreading these ideas, the people stirring up this really powerful energy online. They have a great story to tell, right? About Western colonialists and Zionists taking Palestinian land and so on and so on and so on, right? What is our story? I think is the challenge, right? A simple, compelling story that is not about arguing about this policy or that policy and that, yeah, it was right to blow up this building. I mean, you're never going to win that argument. But a simple, powerful story that cuts across the things that are currently convincing large numbers of teenagers that Israel is just the worst. And I think that is the challenge, basically.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions, so please be very concise in your questions. We'll try and get as many people in. So Seda, the floor is yours. Sorry, Seda, you're muted.
Oh,
okay, sorry.
Thank you very
Okay, go
much.
ahead.
Excellent presentation. I have a question because where I live in Chicago, I saw many Jewish. They were also joining the demonstration for Free Palestine. Do you think they are aware that they are also causing anti-Semitic, threats for Jews?
So this is definitely a feature of what's happened. And look, in the Jewish world, you'll get a very wide spectrum of opinions towards Israel and towards the conflict and so on. And that, that's fine. But what we're also seeing to a certain extent is for progressive Jews, even progressive Jews who campaign on a whole range of progressive causes, any sort of support for Israel, including for Israel's existence, shuts the door. Basically, it removes your entry ticket. Anti-Zionism becomes the entry ticket to retaining their place in radical progressive politics. And that, I think, is very dangerous because what you are seeing is young Jews who, for the best of intentions, for the best of reasons, want to find a way to campaign for Palestinian rights, but balance that with some kind of progressive Zionism. And the ability to maintain that balancing act is being closed down. That space is being closed off. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think that's very, not just sad, but dangerous, actually. And I, you know, that's different from what we saw here in the Corbyn years with much older, very cynical Jews on the far left supporting Corbyn. That's a different phenomenon from the kind of younger elements that we're seeing, I think. And it is a problem.
Thank you. Yehudi Barsky.
Good morning. First, thank you, Dave. It's nice to see you, and thank you for your excellent presentation. I wanted to make two comments that we're seeing basically very similar kind of activity here, where young Jewish people who are liberal and who also consider themselves to be progressive are being shut out of their respective movements, and they're finding themselves in a situation, ideological type of situation that is untenable for them because they feel that they're part of those movements, yet they're being excluded from those movements. The backlash to that has been formation of some new, young, Zionist-oriented organizations. And in other words, if you don't accept us in your club, we're going to make our own, which has been a traditional reaction in the Jewish community for many generations. The other thing that I would comment on, which is similar to what you're seeing, is the normalization of the types of chants that we've seen for many years coming from these types of demonstrations, and I would say the propensity to say we do not need to apologize for any of these kinds of chants. There's one particular supporter of the Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who is a lawyer and an activist. He went on his Twitter account and he wrote a whole screed basically at the end of it saying, "Stop apologizing for anti-Semitism. You're playing their game." And this has really, really taken off in a much more serious way than it has ever done previously, to the degree where, of course, I'm sure people here have all seen the gang violence against Jews throughout the United States, where people feel empowered and legitimized to beat up Jews on the street. And this has been as a result of this kind of rhetoric and the fact that it's multiplied. There's been much more powerful expression of that on social media, and then the reaction as well in the street to target Jewish people on the street. The other thing I regarding this is norm breaking.
Could you please ask a question? We're running out of time.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you, have you also seen norm breaking? In other words, that there is less hesitancy to attack Jews at the street in Britain than there had previously been?
Yes, look, like I said, most of the anti-Semitic attacks that we saw were verbal, not violent. And some of the footage I saw, some of the violent attacks from the United States were really, really shocking, and we didn't see anything on that level. But the taboo against shouting at visibly Jewish people on the street definitely weakened during that period, because if you're shouting Free Palestine, you're not shouting something anti-Semitic, right? You're not shouting Heil Hitler. You're shouting a slogan of liberation. That's the mentality. You just happen to be shouting it at the visibly Jewish person on the street because they're Jewish, right? But that doesn't factor in. But so we've definitely seen that. And the other thing we've seen, which touches on what you said, is the idea that fighting anti-Semitism or opposing anti-Semitism is a pro-Israel activity, right? And that is something, that is an idea, a narrative that definitely gained a lot of traction on the far left during the Corbyn years here. And so we saw that during this conflict as well. Don't bother us with talk about anti-Semitism. If Israel stops killing children, there'll be no anti-Semitism. That kind of message, yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is something we see in academia, as you all know. Yeah. So Rhea and then Ellen, please, very concise questions because we have like 3 minutes left.
So the question I have actually concerns school students more, or protests that are done by school students. And I'm not sure if this is still happening, but back when I was doing my GCSEs, we were asked to study Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, and there are widely misrepresented Jewish stereotypes in the text, and there's a lot of anti-Semitism within it. So I was wondering whether texts like this, if included now in school children's curriculums, could be a potential motivator or fuel for students to engage in anti-Semitic practices even more than it used to happen in the previous days.
There was actually a bit of a debate earlier this year in this country about whether the Merchant of Venice should still be taught in schools, or at what age it should be taught, for exactly this reason. And it was a debate within the broader framing of not quite cancel culture, but kind of, you know, is it appropriate? Is it counterproductive, as you say? You know, but look, personally, I think there's always, as long as these kind of books are taught in the right way, then they can actually be quite positive in terms of how they're taught. But that then depends on the teachers and on the environment, on the atmosphere in the classes, and so on. What you tend to get is things like that can make situations difficult for, if there's one Jewish teacher in the school, for example, and they are kind of expected to be the authority and answer the questions on whether it's Israel, Holocaust, more historic, you know, literature, this kind of stuff. So it has to be handled correctly, I think. I think that is the key to it. But I would be unhappy if things like The Merchant of Venice or Oliver Twist were no longer taught, because, and you can go back to Chaucer, because they are examples and evidence of the history of anti-Semitism in the culture of this country, absolutely the mainstream culture of this country. And that can then be the basis for, I think, really powerful and valuable discussions in schools.
Thank you. So Ellen, a very concise question, and then Mr. Rawlings, Camera, you'll be the last question. I'm sorry I didn't get around to everybody, but please be very concise. And Dave, quick answers, please.
Sure.
Ellen, you're muted.
Thank you, Professor Rich, for a wonderful presentation, just extremely helpful and very sad. My question is, to what extent are the teachers' unions officially voting to support pro-Palestinian positions as a union? And to what extent does this infiltrate into the failure of school administrators to take an active stand against fully protecting Jewish students and teachers?
So the National Education Union, which is the teachers' union, supported the demonstrations, the anti-Israel demonstrations, and the General Secretary of the union spoke at the big demonstrations in London. And a lot of Jewish teachers resigned their membership of the union as a result, which I think certainly the leadership of the union said they were shocked by and unhappy with, and there have been various meetings between them and community since then to see what can be done about it. Look, some schools dealt with these problems very well and others less well. I don't know, in all honesty, if the stance of the union affected how the school administrators reacted, but it probably did affect whether the Jewish teachers were willing to go to their union to look for support.
Right.
And that is the point we tried to make to them.
Thank you very much.
Sirajan, can you ask your question? Are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
The first part of the question has been asked by Kathleen, but the other part is what can we do on the positive side of to promote Israel to gain more popularity and whatever I can think of. The first part has been asked by Kathleen, what has been happening and what has changed. But what can we do to promote Israel on the better side?
Look, I think it comes back to what I said earlier. You know, we need to find a really compelling, engaging way of explaining Israel's story of why it matters that Israel should exist, right? Why Zionism happened, stories of Jewish families and what they went through, and how and Israel's place in the Jewish world and in Jewish history. I think that at that fundamental level, that's the story we need to be telling. We need to find a really engaging way to do it in a way that can engage 16-year-olds looking for something meaningful and progressive to like on TikTok. I mean, we're at that level, basically. I think that's what we need to be trying to do.
Okay, so I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions. There were a lot of questions, which is indicative of the powerful and important presentation Dave gave to us today. So Dave, thank you very much for being here. It's really appreciated. Your work is so important at many levels. So continued strength in your important work and your colleagues. So I know Dave has to go soon, but you're welcome to stick around to hear David Hirsh. David Hirsh is with us now. David is a senior lecturer in the sociology department at Goldsmiths College, which is part of the University of London. Today, he'll speak on contemporary left anti-Semitism. And if anybody wants to look at a good book on left-wing anti-Semitism in the UK, David Hirsch's book is really, I think, the definitive work. And David has been working on these issues now for many years. So David, thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us. The floor is yours.
Hey, Charles, thank you. It's great to hear Dave, as always. Dave doesn't need to stay and listen to me. He's heard me before, I think. Can I share my screen and share some PowerPoints? Yes, I can. Okay. So I couldn't help but start by answering a little bit the question about the Merchant of Venice, which was just asked. And the reason is because I wrote an account of an Israeli theatre company, in fact, the National Israeli Theatre Company, Habima, which came to London as part of a festival, of a global festival of people doing Shakespeare in their own language. And so there was Shakespeare at the Globe Theatre in London in Spanish and in French and in every language, and including Hebrew. And the Israelis brought the Merchant of Venice to London. And of course, the boycotters decided to try to disrupt the performance. And I wrote an account, and my view of the play itself is that the play is a really, really interesting and important play. And I think it can be very usefully read as a play about anti-Semitism, and as a play which is critical of anti-Semitism, and a play in which Shakespeare shows you the kind of vileness of anti-Semitism, actually. So that was my reading. So I did this account of this really interesting play in the circumstances of a boycott threat, and being done in Hebrew and in London. And actually, when I was doing my book, I couldn't work out where to put this account into my book. And somebody who I was working with said, it's great, just put it at the beginning as a preface. So the very first thing you will see in my book is an argument about the Merchant of Venice and an account of a particular performance of it in Hebrew in London, and with boycotters present. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. Thank you, Charles, for your very kind words about the book. So really, I want to try and get through this quite quickly so that hopefully we'll have some time to discuss. I'm sure Dave has been through some of the same material, and a lot of other people have. So I would like just to have time to really go into what you haven't done yet and what you don't understand yet. And having said that, people who say things like that always then speak too long, which is probably what I will do. I want to talk a little bit about method and anti-Semitism as an external social phenomenon, and not just as a kind of internal moral failing. I want to talk a little bit about populism and the new populism and Hannah Arendt. I want to mention the Livingston formulation, which is a standard absolute denial and counter-accusation when anybody raises the issue of anti-Semitism, and the counter-accusation accuses the accuser of raising anti-Semitism dishonestly and disgracefully in an effort to silence criticism of Israel. I want to talk a little about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which in a sense is the heart of the issue. I want to talk a little bit about IRA and the definition, and finish off, I think, where Dave just finished off with some of the most recent developments that we've seen, some of which are quite worrying. So this, if you like, this is the kind of methodological problem of my book. The scholarly analysis of left-wing anti-Semitism has had to develop methods for recognizing and understanding the variant of anti-Semitism in which the social agents who are the carriers of anti-Semitism are unaware of their own role. Indeed, often when they think of themselves as committed opponents of anti-Semitism, and when they angrily deny their own complicity. And I think it's reasonable to assume that the denials are true, and that the self-understanding of people that they oppose anti-Semitism is actually their self-understanding. And that puts us already in quite a difficult position to be trying to work out how to study it and think about it. There's been lots of talk about defining anti-Semitism. And I would begin with a very simple point about definitions in general. And that is this: to define something, you need to know something about the thing that you are defining, right? You cannot define something by looking at it in your own head with your own reason. You cannot define something that you have not looked at in the world. Of course, you need to think, but first you need to look. So the kind of simplest example, something very easy to define, is gold. But you can only define gold when you know something about gold. But as soon as you know that gold is the element whose atomic number is 79, there you go, gold is defined. But you had to know something about gold first. Anti-Semitism is more difficult, but the principle remains. To define anti-Semitism, you need to begin with an empirical study of anti-Semitism. And so often, people who think that they know about anti-Semitism, and people who want to enter into a debate about anti-Semitism, and people who want to debate about how to define anti-Semitism, so often they don't begin by looking at the anti-Semitism as it exists in the world, but they start by looking at the Jews. And they start with their kind of first axiom is that the Jews pretend that things are anti-Semitic that are not anti-Semitic. So instead of starting by looking at anti-Semitism as it exists in the world, in a complex social world, so many people start somewhere else, with the bad behavior of Jews or of Zionists, or with the bad behavior of Israel, and not with the anti-Semitism. And of course, a point that was made many, many times during the conflict recently in May 21 between Israel and Hamas is that the conflict does not spill over into Britain or America or France or into London schools. What happens in Britain or America or France or in London schools is that people think about what's happening in the Middle East, and sometimes they think about it in an anti-Semitic way. and they explain it in an anti-Semitic way, and they look at it through an anti-Semitic prism. And again, it's really, you know, ABC. It may be the case that there is street crime in South London, and it may be the case that Black kids are particularly involved with street crime in South London. Actually, I don't know if it's true or not, but it may be the case. If I was then to look at that fact and say, aha, you know, Black people are by nature open to crime, or, you know, Black people are bad, or if only we hadn't let Black people into Britain, there would be no street crime in South London, or any number of racist comments or racist understandings of what's going on would be racist. And what's the point? The point is that the bad behavior of particular Black kids in South London does not cause racism. What causes racism is understanding particular kinds of bad behavior in a racist way. And the same, of course, is true about the relationship between what happens in the Middle East, which is a real and rather nasty and protracted conflict. It's not a conflict of global proportions by any means. It's not the most serious or the biggest or the most intractable conflict in the world. It's actually quite a small conflict, but it's a conflict that's serious for the people who are involved. And it's real. But the way that it is thought about and talked about far away is often not real. And that's how we think about anti-Semitic narrative, I think. As you'll know, I'm a sociologist. Anti-Semitism is a social phenomenon. It's not something which is just happening inside my head. And I could talk for hours on some of this methodological stuff, which I'm quite interested in at the moment. Durkheim talked about social facts, to treat social facts as things. Social facts are not things that happen inside my head or inside your head, but they are things that happen inside the cultural spaces in between our heads, and they relate to the material world in which we live. So social facts are complicated, but we should treat them as though they're external to any human being, and we should think about them objectively. And, you know, Marx kind of says the same thing. Men make history, human beings make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They make it under circumstances all existing already. And both of these points actually are about the relationship between structure and agency. Human beings have agency, but they are born into social structure, and they are part of social structure. They're given language, they're given ways of thinking and ways of being and ways of understanding. But they are also agents. They're not just kind of creatures of the social structures in which they find themselves. And where do the social structures come from? They come from social agents. They're created by social agents. So structure and agency are, I think, rather important. And the reason I'm kind of going back to this very, very basic ABC stuff is that when serious people talk about anti-Semitism, they suddenly lose their bearings and they lose their whole method of thinking sometimes. So like racism, anti-Semitism is not just an individual moral failure. It is an external, objective, structural phenomenon. Anti-Semitism exists independently of any individual's subjective self-consciousness or intentions. It's out there in the world, in our history, in our culture, in our shared meanings and shared understandings, and our readiness to look at things that happen in the real world through its lens. And its lens exists in the culture. And the reason, again, why this needs saying is because very often people who understand this stuff very, very well in their own fields. You know, look at Judith Butler and her work on gender, for example. You might like it or you might not like it, but she understands the complexity of social structure and given ways of thinking and being about gender. But ask her about anti-Semitism and she won't do it in that way at all. She will look inside her own head and she will say to herself, Judith, are you anti-Semitic? Are you bad? Are you racist? Are you prejudiced? And she will say, no, Judith, I am not. And she will then get very cross because she will say, why are these people saying that I am? And the reason that these people are saying that she is because of what she does and what she says and how she relates to the external world and the external structures of anti-Semitism. They're not about her inner goodness or inner badness. You can be good or bad or whatever, I don't care. You can still be anti-Semitic. People might want to argue with me about that, but you understand the point, right? Is that, you know, human beings are part of the social world in which they live. That's why we talk about things like institutional anti-Semitism, about the norms and practices and ways of thinking of particular kinds of institutions. I heard a story today about a university in London, and I'll come onto it later, but there was one of these sort of loyalty tests was produced by its student union, and its students union said that everything, if you are subjected to police violence in America, you're a victim of Zionism. And if you're subjected to sexual violence in Britain, you're a victim of Zionism. And it was this kind of anti-Semitic way of kind of mistaken way of doing intersectionality. And a Jewish student made a complaint, and I heard about what happened in the discussion about the complaints process, and somebody said, well, the Jewish student just wanted, wanted the university to apologize and to take it off the website. And somebody in the meeting said, well, I don't think that could be achieved here. What, an apology and it taken off the website? Couldn't be achieved here. Why not? That was an admission of institutional anti-Semitism, of the institution being such that it could not apologize and it could not repair their website. Cultural anti-Semitism, ways of thinking, political anti-Semitism, the ways in which anti-Semitism is functional inside ways of thinking, worldviews, politics. Pascal, according to Althusser, Pascal says more or less, kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe. Obviously, praying is kind of supposed to be the other way around, right? You're supposed to pray because you believe. So it's supposed to be the other way. You believe, therefore you move your lips in prayer. That's why you're kneeling. Pascal says no. He says that it's at least possible that belief and ideas come out of social practice and out of the material world. So if you spend your time every day, 3 times a day, kneeling, and if you pray, then you really ought to come to believe, and you probably will. Why do I give you this? There's a Labour MP who was he was actually well to the right of Corbyn, I think, when he started out. And he started to defend Corbyn and to defend the Corbyn movement, not because he was anti-Semitic, but because he liked the idea of socialism and a radical challenge that he thought Corbyn presented and all the rest of it. And people said that Corbyn was anti-Semitic, and they gave all kinds of ways in which Corbyn was anti-Semitic. And this MP said, well, how do I defend Corbyn? And he started defending Corbyn, and the only way you can defend somebody who's accused of anti-Semitism, if they are anti-Semitic, is by mobilizing anti-Semitic defenses. So he found himself, because he was in the position of wanting to defend Corbyn and his movement, he found himself reaching for anti-Semitic ideas and anti-Semitic arguments. And in the end, in a sense, he was too honest and too open, because he said the anti-Semitic things more openly and more clearly than everybody else. And in the end, the Labour Party expelled him, and he was very angry. And he said, "Why don't you expel everybody else?" And they said, "Ha ha ha." And in the end, this guy came to Rothschild's conspiracy fantasy, and he started tweeting about the Rothschilds and all of the kind of most clear and explicit anti-Semitism. He started not with a hatred of Jews or anything about Jews. He started by wanting to defend Corbyn's socialism. First he knelt, then he prayed, then he believed. First he was in the movement, then he found the things to say to defend the movement, and then he ended up tweeting out the Rothschilds. I want to talk a little about the Livingston formulation. It was such a pleasure when I wrote the book, because I could do chapter 1, the Livingston formulation, and I could explain it and I could give examples of it.
Sorry,
And then
David,
I could
David, sorry to interrupt. If you can wrap it up in like 3 or 4 minutes, that would be great. Then we could have Q&A.
Oh, sure. I haven't really started yet, Charles, but I will anyway wrap it up. So chapter 1, the Livingston formulation. And this is the quote from Ken Livingstone back in, I don't remember, 2006, I think. "For far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been." In other words, Livingstone was accused of anti-Semitism, and his response was to say, "I know what they're up to, those people who are accusing me. They're up to trying to silence and smear my criticism of Israel." And you will all have seen this countless times. I started with chapter 1, the Livingston formulation, with I think 30 or 40 examples of it. The key argument against the IRA definition of anti-Semitism is the Livingston formulation, which is that, well, there's nothing really wrong with the text itself, but we know what it's used for. And it's used by Trumpists and Zionists and Tories to prevent people from criticizing Israel. In other words, the accusation of anti-Semitism is a Jewish, tribal, selfish mechanism. And this is quite important, because people will know that in the political sphere, this is the standard response, but also in the academic sphere, this is the standard response. You are not a real academic. What you really are is somebody trying to delegitimize criticism, which is a very serious accusation in academia. I'm going to jump till the end very quickly, to the right place. Dave already mentioned that the discourse got significantly worse during the last conflict. And this tweet is a demonstration of exactly how the discourse got worse. This tweet says, "I am an academic and I call for a free Palestine and an end to the Israeli state's apartheid. This is integral to both my moral worldview and my scholarship. Pass it on." All of the loyalty tests said, you must be for a boycott of Israel. You must say that Israel is apartheid. You must say that Israel is illegitimate and should be smashed. And you must affirm that that worldview is integral to scholarship. In other words, if you don't hold on to that worldview, you're not a proper scholar. And actually, you're not even a moral person, because that worldview is also integral to my morality. And what these loyalty tests do is they define the boundaries of personal morality and professional integrity according to a measure using Israel as a kind of a symbol of all badness in the world. So the narrative of Israel as apartheid and boycotted and needing to be smashed is all anti-Semitic in itself, but it's anti-Semitic in a second way because the loyalty tests propose that as a measure of your whole morality and your whole ability to be a scholar. So I'm going to stop, and hopefully there's time for people to ask me questions.
Okay, David, thank you very much for sharing your insights in your presentation. I see there's a lot of questions. Please put up your electronic hand and I'll try and work as many of you into the conversation. So Andreas, please go ahead, and then James.
Yeah, dear David, thank you very much for the interesting lecture. It's great to see you. A very important, but also I think questionable point in your slides was that anti-Semitism exists even without self-consciousness, if I understood it right, and without intentions. However, I would argue that without subjects endowed with consciousness, social phenomena such as anti-Semitism, as you described it, cannot exist either. Wouldn't we have to take psychology, perhaps also psychoanalysis for help here? That's my question. It's a big question, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Andres, hi, great to see you. It's a good question. I suspect if we did take psychoanalysis into account, we would still find that people were unconscious of what we would say would be their inner unconscious anti-Semitism. I think it's actually, you see, it's my experience. My experience is that people capable of saying the most clearly anti-Semitic things have no self-consciousness of what they're doing. They have no understanding of what they're doing, and they do not believe themselves to be anti-Semitic. The opposite, they believe themselves to be good, and they believe themselves to be the real opponents of anti-Semitism, and they believe themselves to be anti-racists. I mean, we could discuss this at great length. Then what do we need to believe? We need to believe that they're lying when they say that they know that actually they stand in the tradition of Bruno Bauer and Adolf Hitler and you know, Ayatollah Khomeini. They know that, but really they're pretending not to, and that's just not plausible actually, and it's not necessary, because it's actually a really important point, I think, that people get caught up with structures of thinking and ordinary kinds of beliefs that become common sense. Let me just give you one more answer to that. As I said, I think during the recent conflict, people, I mean, ordinary kids, you know, kids in the street, 16-year-old kids with Palestine flags, they believed that there was genocide going on. They believed that the Israelis were carpet bombing thousands of children. They believe that the Israelis are just murdering people because that's what Israelis do, because they're racist, because they're imperialist, all the rest of it. If you believe that stuff, it's kind of reasonable to want to boycott them or to want to criticize them or to say they're genocidal or whatever. So again, the way that people think and the beliefs that people are given and that they accept are very important. And you don't need a kind of self-consciousness of being an anti-Semite to explain that.
Okay, thank you. James, go ahead, please.
So first of all, thank you very much, Professor Hirsh, for the very interesting presentation. I come at this from the point of view of being an American literary scholar, so I'd be very interested in your, well, it's taught Merchant of Venice, but that's beside the point. I have two interrelated questions, and it has to do with basically, why aren't Jews believed? Because one of the tenets of Black Lives Matter and Me Too, at least in the United States and probably around the world, is that people who are that people of a particular social group or victim group, depending on your estimation, are experts of their own situation and thus need to be believed when they say that they've been raped or they've been treated they've been victims of racism. So from a sociological perspective, why aren't Jews believed in the same way? And then just I believe that anti-Semitism and racism is just another kind of racism coming from a historical perspective. So couldn't we say that all kinds of racism are external social phenomena and not just anti-Semitism? So what makes anti-Semitism unique in this situation?
Right. Two great questions, which I'll try and deal with quickly, although I could talk for an hour on each. The first one about being believed. Firstly, I think, look, obviously people say that, you know, if a Black person experiences racism, then their own account of it should be believed. But I don't think the people who insist on that are always consistent in doing it, right? So, you know, if the person who is Black says something that they don't like, then they will not sort of defer to that. They will say, well, you know, they'll give some other kind of explanation. So firstly, I think the people who say that belief is a key issue aren't actually consistent anyway, even in the sphere that they say that they are consistent in. And of course, this is one of the key importance of anti-Zionist Jews, because anti-Zionist Jews they sort of parade their Jewish identity and parade their own identity as though they were in a special position to speak on behalf of Jews. Of course, it's a very strange inversion of identity politics, because normally identity politics says, I have a special understanding of my own situation due to my experience, and therefore, you know, you should take my understanding of the things that go wrong for me seriously. But the anti-Zionist Jews say, I have an understanding of just how bad the Jewish community really is, because I'm Jewish and I can, you know, so it's an inversion of identity politics. Look, I think a proper kind of standpoint theory, a proper notion. Look, it's true, I don't know, for example, when, you know, before women were doing sociology or legal studies, when it was only men, sociology and legal studies didn't take sexual violence very seriously, right? And it's because, you know, women came along and feminists came along and they said, look, there are all these issues here that are being missed. And part of the reason they're being missed is because it's being done by men and this is not in their experience. So I think that, you know, standpoint theory is important. I think that you need to take people's experience seriously. But of course, that does not mean that anybody with a particular kind of experience, therefore, tells the truth in an unquestioned way. In Britain, it's quite interesting to trace the Macpherson inquiry, which was held into institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police. And Macpherson said, when somebody says they have experienced a racist crime, the police should begin by assuming that that's true. And they should begin under the, you know, similar to sexual violence. Investigators should begin by assuming it's true and they should proceed. But of course, if they then find out it wasn't true, then, you know, they can then change their mind according to the evidence. But Livingston, of course, tells us that if it's a Jewish person who says they've suffered anti-Semitism, then we should begin with the assumption that it's not true and that it's a Zionist trick to try to silence criticism of Israel. And I mean, the latest thing was that the EHRC, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, reported on Labour anti-Semitism. And one of the key things they said was that this accusation that Jews weaponize anti-Semitism, or they exaggerate it, or they mobilize it for their own power, that this is the key way in which contemporary anti-Semitism works. And it is a form of anti-Semitism in itself. And that was really interesting that EHRC kind of ratified the Livingston formulation in a kind of, in the language of English equalities law. I could say much more about that. Of course, the problem is that the accusation of bad faith is what alienates Jews. It's what kicks us out of the space that we're in. So if we're in the Labour Party and we raise the issue of anti-Semitism, and somebody says, because you've raised the issue of anti-Semitism, I know that you cannot be a genuine member of the Labour Party. Then that's how we get kicked out. Just very quickly on racism and anti-Semitism, I'm not even going to start there, but it's a really interesting kind of, people have really heated positions on both sides, that on the one hand, anti-Semitism is completely different from racism and it's unique. And on the other hand, anti-Semitism is a form of racism like other forms of racism. And it's quite an interesting debate. I think, of course, in the end, you need to ask what's at stake in the debate, because everything in some sense is similar to everything else and everything is unique. So you know, we're looking at kind of levels of uniqueness. I think it's important to think about anti-Semitism alongside racism and other bigotries, but it's also important to look at what is unique about it. I don't have time to go further.
That's fine. Thanks. Okay, thank you. So what I'm going to try to do, we have 2 minutes left and a lot of people want to ask questions. So I'm going to ask several people to please be very concise, 1 or 2 sentence questions, very to the point. So Noah, and we're going to collect them. So just go through it. Noah, Max, Louisa, and Kane. Please ask your questions succinctly, and I'm sorry that the others will not be able to ask, but you can email David if you wish. So very quickly, Noah, a concise question.
Yes, it wasn't clear to me, David, thank you very much, by the way, if the MP who you were talking about earlier before Livingstone, was that who you were talking about, who tried to defend Corbyn? Because I don't believe you mentioned their name. Could you share that?
It's funny because I always worry that I get his name wrong, because I've got a Freudian thing about him, actually. So I don't like to mention his name because in case I get it wrong, but I'll find it for you and I'll get back to you. Okay,
thank you. Max, very to the point, and then Louisa, let's collect some questions. And then
yeah, I was just wondering to what extent, David, do you think that academia has just been swept up in a culture of sort of virtue signaling with this kind of pro-Palestine, anti-Israeli rhetoric? Thank you.
Cool, good question. Louisa, what's your question?
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, can you please make a comment on correlation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? For example, the Satmar Hasidic Jews in the United States, are they anti-Semitic because they are anti-Zionist? And what do you think about post-Zionism? Do you agree that it's a form of anti-Zionism too, or not? Thank you.
Thank you. And Kane, very quickly, your question.
Just when you said about anti-Semitism as like being a cultural object, like it's not just in your imagination sort of thing, do you think that's like plays a large role in why there's a lot of subconscious anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes in communities that don't even have like a large Jewish population living among them?
Great questions. Now welcome to the second lecture by David Hirsh.
The guy was Chris Williamson, the MP. Anti-Zionism and academia. I mean, I could talk a long time about academia. I think that there is, I think there's a minority of people in academia who are kind of clearly carriers of this kind of anti-Semitism. Firstly, a minority of disciplines, really, and secondly, a minority within those disciplines. But it's a kind of minority which is allowed to speak for the whole, which people are worried about challenging. So I think, you know, it is actually a very small minority of academics who are really worked out, who are really pushers of a worked out anti-Semitic politics or worldview, but they're kind of accepted in good coin. So I think that would be the way I would put that. But I think there is a real serious problem. I mean, I've been working to help a student, for example, who's had an essay failed and therefore has not been awarded her degree because she wrote an essay that was fundamentally focused on Hamas and critical of Hamas, and that was considered to be a fail. And, you know, so this kind of thing is quite important, and it's accepted and it's allowed. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, you raised the Satmar, for example. I mean, I'm not sure, I certainly know that extreme groups like Neturei Karta, for example, are quite conscious of embracing, they're quite conscious of siding with anti-Semites against Jews. You know, they side with, they go to anti-Semitic demonstrations, they go to conferences in Iran, and they're very happy to say anti-Semitic things and to push anti-Semitic politics and to push anti-Semitic worldviews and to help anti-Semitic movements. So if you say, ah, yes, but are they anti-Semitic? Then I don't know what the question means, which perhaps goes back to the question from Andreas about the subjective self-consciousness. I think Jews are very important carriers and pushers of anti-Semitism. And I don't think Jews are sort of useful idiots. I think Jews in some senses are leaders of the anti-Semitic movement, certainly in Britain, probably in America. And I think that Jewish anti-Semitism is very important. And because anti-Semitism is an external objective social formation, it would be madness to think that it would be impossible for Jews to get caught up in it, or to be so afraid that they go along with it, or to prefer to live in a world where anti-Semitism is not this irrational, threatening, terrible thing, but is in fact rational criticism. So there are many reasons why Jews might embrace anti-Semitism, and they certainly do so. And the last question was, oh God, remind me.
Want me to repeat the question again?
Go on quickly.
Yeah, I was just saying, so when you were saying like anti-Semitism as a cultural object that's not just in your mind, but is sort of like in the cultural space around us, how much of a role do you think that plays in subconscious anti-Semitic tropes that make their way into the minds of people who like don't even live among other Jews in some communities?
I think, I mean, one could look at, if you like, look at David Nirenberg's book, which kind of looks at a whole global history of anti-Semitism, and then look at Hannah Arendt's warning that we should look at each anti-Semitism separately in different historical times and places and reasons and social milieus. And which do we pick? And the truth is that both are true. So the truth is that each discrete and different anti-Semitism picks up tropes and images from previous ones and mobilizes them in new ways and in their own ways and in their different ways. And I think some of that can only be explained through a kind of notion of the cultural unconsciousness. The truth is that where people want to embrace and fight for anti-democratic politics, where they want to fight for conspiracy fantasy, then this anti-Semitic notion of the Jews, which has been developed in different times and different places over so many different centuries, this anti-Semitic notion of the Jews is just so useful for being the image of evil. And yes, I think you couldn't really understand that unless you understand that somehow in the cultural unconscious there are these tropes which are emotionally satisfying as ways of feeling the evil that exploits us and that does evil unto us.
Okay, David, on behalf of everybody else, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today and for providing your insights and assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Hi, Sammy.
Thanks, and sorry I couldn't get into all the questions. So we have about a 20-minute break, and we'll come back to hear Professor Jonathan Wolff of Oxford and Professor Steve Ross of